Two multicolored fish created from layers of geometric shapes swim to reveal the company name, accessibilityconsulting.ca. A school of small fish swims by, revealing the tagline, a collective of digital accessibility educators.
Welcome. My name is Jennifer Curry-Yonke. I am the Principal Educator with accessibilityconsulting.ca. We're a collective of digital accessibility educators. I am also a member of the Postsecondary Education Standards Development Committee. I'll be your host. Rosalie Vasseurs will be our ASL interpreter today. You can utilize the closed captioning tool at the bottom of your screen. The session will be recorded and sent out to everyone registered after it has been captioned. It will also be posted to our YouTube channel. Because we're a larger group, I'm going to ask everyone to keep their microphones and cameras off to help with bandwidth. We'll keep the comments to a minimum in the chat feature for optimal accessibility and listening, reserving the chat feature for asking questions as we go. If you do have a question, please feel free to use the raise your hand feature and I'll call on you to turn on your camera and microphone, or write in the chat and I'll read it out loud at key points throughout the presentation. Today we will be discussing the Postsecondary Education Standards for the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the AODA. The proposed AODA education standard is comprised of recommendations from three subcommittees: the K-12 recommendations, the post-secondary recommendations, and a technical subcommittee's recommendations that focused on transition planning. Today, we're honored to have Tina Doyle, Chair of the Post-Secondary Committee, here to provide us with an overview of the post-secondary recommendations on how to create an inclusive and accessible higher education environment under the AODA. Over the following months, we'll dive into each of the 8 barrier areas, starting with barrier area 4, the digital learning and technology, next month. You can join our mailing list to be notified of upcoming workshops at accessibilityconsulting.ca. I'm going to put a few links in the chat for you to look at as we go. Let me start by introducing our guest today. Tina Doyle is the Director of Accessibility Services at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, a sessional lecturer in the Department of Health and Society, and Chair of the Postsecondary Education Standards Development Committee. As the Director of Accessibility Services, Tina provides leadership on accommodation and accessibility. Tina has worked to address systemic barriers and social justice in education for over 25 years. She has an interest in coalition forming between disability services and disability studies, and advocacy approaches to disrupt systems and create positive social change. With 10 years' experience participating on ministry working groups, the Minister for Seniors and Accessibility appointed Tina to lead the province's legislated AODA Post-Secondary Education Standards Development Committee. The committee developed recommendations to address systemic barriers in education provided by Ontario publicly funded colleges and universities. Tina was also appointed to the Government of Ontario's Accessibility Standards Advisory Council and is a member of the Ministry of Colleges and Universities Disability Issues Financial Aid Working Group. Tina holds a Master of Science in Disability Services in Higher Education from CUNY and completed a graduate certificate in post-secondary disability services from the University of Connecticut. Tina, thanks so much for being here today, especially because we know how busy September is in higher education, and yet it is such a pivotal time in being able to enact change towards creating an inclusive and accessible environment as students work towards a successful semester.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. At first, I want to say it was a pleasure working with you on the committee.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate you organizing this event and keeping the conversation going around the AODA and the education standards. I think it's important that we continue to bring it to the forefront. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being here. Why don't we start things off by you maybe providing us a quick overview of the proposed AODA education standard and kind of how we got here. I think it might be helpful to our audience members who might not be familiar with the Ontario regulation.
Sure. I'll provide a high level overview of the AODA, and there is a link to the legislation information to review if you're interested. The information I'm sharing is publicly available on those websites. So the government of Ontario, they've highlighted on their website something, we celebrated that Ontario is the first province of one of the first jurisdictions in the world to enact specific legislation establishing a goal and time frame for accessibility. So it's also the first jurisdiction to legislate accessibility reporting and to establish standards in the areas like employment, transportation, and design of public spaces. So you'll see this in the legislation. The purpose of the AODA, which is the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, it's written into the legislation. They recognize, the law recognizes the discrimination against persons with disabilities. And really the purpose of the act is to develop, implement, and enforce accessibility standards in order to achieve accessibility in Ontarians with disabilities, for Ontarians with disabilities in respect to goods, services, facilities, accommodations, employment, buildings, structures, and premises. The goal is on or before January 1st, 2025, and we are getting very close. And as well, it's for providing the involvement of people with disabilities bringing in people with disabilities to represent the industries and the different areas in the development of the standards. So that was an important part of our committee. So one method to achieve this purpose is to develop standards. And so we have the standard development committees. There were a number that have been developed, and then the standards are reviewed as well. So the ones we have already in legislation, we have the customer service standard. We have general requirements, which is part of IASR.
Yeah.
And then we have the information communication, employment, transportation, design of public spaces. And then right now, the government is looking at and reviewing the education standard for the K-12, post-secondary, and the health standard.
Thank you for that. As a committee member, I feel like it would be very valuable to start this conversation off by sharing the guiding principles of the post-secondary recommendations. Would you mind kind of going over those? Those were impactful for me.
Sure. I think it's a good question. I think to help the audience understand the thought that was put into this process. The committee recognized it was really important that we move from intention to action. So beyond just saying we're going to do something, we wanted to really make sure there's actions behind what we're establishing, and to improve recruitment, retention, graduation rates for students with disabilities, and employment rates, and to ensure that students felt welcome, a sense of belonging, and have an opportunity to participate in, really all aspects of post-secondary life. So to achieve this, we needed to be grounded in key principles, which can be found in our report. So these included, accessibility efforts should be proactive rather than reactive. So that was really important, to be able to ensure that people can come into a space or whatever it may be and not necessarily have to ask for accommodation or exceptions in different spaces. You can never eliminate accommodation, but certainly if we create an environment that's more accessible, it can reduce it. It was also really important that we keep an intersectional lens on the work. That was an important principle, and you can see it throughout the report. We recognize that disability is a critical aspect of diversity and intersectionality. So we recognize that there really had to be a recognition of this in the work that we were doing. throughout the academic journey of a student, not just, as they enter, really thinking about who they are and their experiences with multiple identities. The other principle was that we really want to make sure that students ought to navigate the system that is transparent and seamless. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when I'm talking about the standard. We also really wanted to encourage innovation and like celebrate, thinking outside the box. And that was important for us to really think about the principle of just not thinking of the, what do we usually do? It's trying to think of what else can we be doing. The other principle was this is a shared responsibility across everybody at an institution. And so that was important to think about that in our principles. But at the end of the day, also, we were very much grounded in human rights. The AODA complements the Ontario Human Rights Code. And in our consultations, the Ontario Human Rights Commission wrote, I'm going to quote this from them, they wrote, they were pleased to see human rights principles and obligations affirmed throughout the committee's recommendations. And they believe if the post-secondary system follows these recommendations, by 2025, colleges and universities will be significantly more accessible, equitable, inclusive, and learner-centered.
Yeah, and I think that the principle of innovation should be celebrated was really put to the test because of our committee went over COVID. And so
yes,
we really learned a lot from that.
Yeah, I think the pandemic taught us a lot about being innovative. And because of that, we've highlighted in our cover letter about we need to take our lessons learned from the pandemic to continue to make spaces accessible.
Yeah. I mean, as a committee, we had to learn ourselves.
Yeah.
Over the course of the committee's work, we had a wide range of barriers come to the forefront based on the feedback that we received from the disability community, from our committee members' own expertise and research, from previous reviews, and from the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Could you speak about these barriers and provide just a brief overview of how people can kind of go about approaching the standard?
Sure. The committee identified barriers that were not covered in existing barriers, or if we did find through our consultations and our own experience that there were barriers that were covered under another standards, such as the customer service standard. Service animals came up a few times. Yeah. We did reference them and make a recommendation to review the barrier that we've addressed when they review the customer service standard, for example. We really, we were specifically asked to look at developer recommendations that are for publicly funded colleges and universities, academic accreditation standards, and post-secondary credential related issues are not within the committee's. They weren't in the committee's scope as they were governed by university and college senates. We did, though, like I said, if we still encountered something, we addressed it. We thought this was the opportunity to put this on the table and address it. So what we did is we were tasked to identify both regulatory and non-regulatory actions to remove the barriers. So what this means is really, so regulation is law. And then the non-regulatory approach is the non-mandatory way to achieve a desired outcome. So it means that it wasn't a specific imposing a specific requirement. So it's not enforced by government, but there could be, we made non-regulatory recommendations. Some of those were those related to AODA, the scope. But an example of that would be the public awareness campaign through our committee. We recognize the type of actions done with a combination of other actions, such as regulation, can really help shift the narrative around disability. So the committee focused on 9 barrier areas. And then, as you mentioned, we had the subcommittee. We had a subcommittee of members working with the K-12 Education Standard Committee members to create the transition report and looking at the barrier between the sectors. So there's really three reports available that the government is looking through. So the first barrier area.
That's hard to say, isn't it?
It's hard, and I have it's hard for me with my R's. But there's we talked about the general overarching barriers, and that's really predominantly relevant for the ministers and executive leaders at the post-secondary sector. So we really called for what we call transformational leadership, and we reference a definition in our report by Jafari that states transformational leadership is an approach that causes change in individuals and social systems. So we don't want to make superficial changes. We need support to shift the culture, and it takes everybody's support. So that's, you'll see that in the general overarching. We have attitudes, barriers, perceptions, and assumptions. And just some highlights. We just talked about developing multiple strategies, including things around change management, creating a campus climate plan, data collection and performance metrics, and establishing an accessibility advisory committee. The next one was awareness and training. And we really looked at the government to help lead development of training and consultation with institutions and those with lived experience. I want to highlight those two barrier areas. We recognize that you can't legislate attitude change. And this was a lot of discussions we had around, you can't legislate it, but what can we do to shift the culture and to educate and inform people to help shift that culture. The fourth one was on assessment, curriculum, and instruction. And this is really talking about systemic changes to how curriculum is designed and measured for quality. And we referenced the universal design for learning approach, which the Ontario Human Rights Commission also references. The next one was on digital learning and technology. And the highlights for that one is really that students with disabilities must be able to independently and effectively access and use technology, produce and consume content, and engage in learning. The sixth one was on organizational barriers, and the highlights for that one, so our goal is to eliminate systemic barriers, really by developing and implementing organizational policies and procedures that from the outset consider the rights and needs of all full-time and part-time students with disabilities. I'll give you an example, I think, at some point today. Social realms was another topic, a barrier area. So the highlight was really focusing on the barriers that hinder students with disabilities from accessing and successfully engaging in campus life. So outside the classroom, there's a lot of focus on in the classroom, but there's so much that goes on outside the classroom. Another area was on physical and architectural barriers, and really looking at new class leading standards for the built environment and meaningful inclusion of and perspectives of those with disabilities around physical and architectural barriers. Okay, and the last one was on financial barriers. This really addressed any systemic and structural barriers to financial support and funding, and talking about transparency. And this related to graduate students funding part-time and full-time students with disabilities. Those are the 9 areas, quick overview.
There's a lot in there.
Yeah.
So the proposed post-secondary education standards, the final recommendations report, you submitted it in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
Where are we today? What has happened since you submitted it, submitted the recommendations, and what's happening now?
Sure. I continue to engage with the ministry to discuss progress of the review of the final recommendations. I've met with the minister, I've met with the for seniors and accessibility, I've met with teams from the Ministry of Colleges and Universities. They have been very open to discussing their progress, and I've talked to them about what can I want to be able to share publicly in these kind of venues. People are asking this question about what's happening, and it's been a year, over a year. So, you know, I from what my experience so far in my conversations with the ministry and what I see happening, I think a lot of things happen behind the scenes that we don't see. But the ministry is committed to continuing to provide information, to share information. So they are, the ministry of, I will tell you, the Ministry of Colleges and Universities currently, they're in the midst of an in-depth consultation with stakeholders around recommendations in the report. And the appropriate next step to achieve these outcomes, be the operational, legislative, and/or regulatory. They are also, as part of the consultations, looking at where additional funding might be needed to achieve the goals. Those are things we talked about in our recommendations. So they're taking all our recommendations seriously. There are a lot of recommendations. They are going through each one of them. We did highlight in our cover letter for the recommendations that throughout the public feedback process, we heard consistent calls from the post-secondary institutions, as well as the Commission, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, for adequate and stable government funding to support the implementation of new accessibility standards for post-secondary education. And our committee wholeheartedly supported that request. So, you know, obviously the ministry is going to be looking at every recommendation. The government is also, right now, they're also reviewing all of the recommendations really for all the SDCs, Standard Development Committees. They have to look at, they're also looking at like Rich Donovan's fourth legislative review of the AODA. They've received that early this summer. So they're looking at those recommendations in addition, in concert with the recommendations from the Standard Committee. So the recommendations made by the committee continue to guide conversations around how best to help people with disabilities, both specifically in post-secondary education, the education sector, but also more broadly across all of Ontario.
I'm just going to pause there for a second, Tina, and ask if anybody has a question for Tina. Otherwise, I have more that I can go on. But we want to give the audience the opportunity to participate in this discussion. So you can raise your hand and you can turn on your mic and camera when I call your name, or you can put your question in the chat feature and I can read it out to Tina. So I'll let you think on that. Jacqueline, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Tina, with respect to the timelines, there are, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Oh, good. Okay. The timelines are extremely tight timelines. And for large institutions, there's a lot of things that have to be put in place, a lot of approvals, a lot of collaboration to get anything done. I mean, just going through the recommendations, I've been part of the committee to just simply go through those recommendations. It has taken us months just to go through each of them to determine who's responsible, who we need to contact. We haven't even assigned costs yet to some of the implementation aspects of it. So can you discuss a little bit about those strict timelines and what happens if we cannot meet those timelines? Because that's one of our major concerns.
Yeah.
Tina, that goes in line with Kim's question on, is there any discussion on timeline extensions? So maybe you could.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, right now we don't have anything even moving towards the legislation yet. So I will say this, and we recognize there's a lot of recommendations.
185.
Yeah, we know there's a lot of recommendations. In the cover letter we provided, we really encouraged institutions to start doing exactly what you just said, Jacqueline, where you're starting to go through them to identify what can you implement now. Really, we released an interim report last year in the fall, of September. Yeah, in the fall, September 2021. My timelines are getting mixed up. 2021. Yes, because then we submitted the final in 2022.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot of significant change between the interim, the initial recommendations and the final recommendations. So we've, to be honest, kind of took the stance that, you know, we're giving institutions really a 2-year heads up that we don't necessarily need legislation for a number of things that are in the recommendation report. There's things that institutions can go ahead and start to address. There's some things we recognize is a sector-wide response. So, and there's some costs associated. So there's certain things we know will have to be held off, but there's smaller things. So I've talked to, I remember talking to a provost who contacted me about this very question, that, you know, we've talked about chunking it and, you know, parsing it out of like who could be responsible in the institution. Because certainly in Ontario, we have AODA coordinators. They're usually one person. It is not possible. This has to be a collective responsibility, and they need support from everybody. But I'll give you an example. One of the recommendations is under organizational barriers. So organizational barriers are the ones that I don't see necessarily some of them costing very much money or anything at all. So one of them, for example, is recommendation 92. That one's really about transparency of information, which is one of our principles. So it's about creating a place for information, so that, because so often there's policies and processes that are different to accommodate people with disabilities, but they don't know about it. And so then they self-select out of something because a policy appears that they're not eligible. For example, if a policy says they have to be full-time, but in reality, we know we're accommodating if they're part-time, just as an example. So, you know, if you look at, and so one of the recommendations was around like in admissions and recruitment, and really looking at, can the admissions and recruitment office look at some of those organizational barriers and start implementing, like looking at their application and just looking at, do we have this information on our website? So that, you know, I can appreciate, because I think our sector is overloaded. I can appreciate that. So it's those sort of things where we can start implementing now. So that will help when the timelines come closer to, where we've been able to implement things that are smaller and easier to do by the time legislation is enacted. So that's one. In terms of timeline, I mean, I think, like as I said, if we start going through this and not waiting for the legislation, then timeline is less of a concern. So I don't know when, I actually have no information around timelines, when it will be implemented, what's happening yet. So it's a little harder. You know, I see there's a question, what can be expected for January 1st, 2025? This is where it's outside of me in terms of, we've given our recommendations and we're waiting for the ministry to bring forward recommendations. I hope, you know, we'll hear more for 2024, whether or not we're seeing it come through in 2024. And so the timelines, that'll need to be a further discussion with the ministry once we know what is in the legislation, because we don't know what it'll look like. So I will say, you will see this in other standards reports. What our report looks like to the public, what you see now, is not what it'll look like when it's rolled out in legislation. Like it will look different. So we don't know yet what will roll out. So we encourage you to go through what we've put out publicly, and I think timelines will have to be discussed once we know what's actually going through in legislation.
Before we get to Kate, I'm just going to say that one thing that Tina was very clear with the committee on when we got the feedback the first round was to really take a look at our timelines and try to expand them as much as we could within the parameters that we were given of 2025. So we tried very hard to be considerate of timelines given the parameters that we worked within. Kate, you're.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Hi, Tina. Nice to meet you in person, online. And I'm going to apologize. I'm a bit of a verbal processor, but I do have a point and I do have a question. a little bit of context, I work at McMaster. We're currently undergoing a bit of an institutional project to understand feasibility of even thinking about the breadth and approach that one would take to implementing the recommendations kind of as a whole, right? Sort of looking at the entirety. I've worked a lot with this sector. I've worked a lot with Jen, worked a lot with our colleagues who sit across the province in terms of participating in the feedback sessions, and a couple of the committee members sit in our AODA COP, Community of Practice People group. And so had thought a lot about the structure you folks had provided that like mimics a change management plan that has consideration for scaffolded timelines, and thinking about how a lot of those recommendations build off of each other. And I'm starting to wrap my brain around different approaches organizations can take to that type of change management structure. And I think you're right. I think like there's a lot of, I hate the expression low hanging fruit. I think there's a lot of it. And I think a lot of it sits in the administrative areas of the university. Even if I'm thinking about the way that you folks have structured Barrier Area 7, theoretically your facilities team coupled with some academic and finance planning folks can work together to implement that standard in its entirety. Even though it'll take a lot of work, I think it can kind of consistently work together. I think the piece where I keep, we're doing a lot of interviews right now of folks who are sitting in key areas across the institution who sit at two levels. One is sort of academic leadership and the other is sitting at the level of the subject matter expert. And it seems, at least it feels like a trend is coming about that the closer we get to the heart of the academic mechanism of the university, i.e. faculty, right? Like to faculty and the values that faculty operate within, the more skeptical and not cynical, but just sort of it's not even resistant. I think people are just naturally critical, thinking about whether or not we could enforce some of the recommendations that have come out, specifically under sections 3 and 4, probably more closely, but there's a couple under section 2 that I think would align, like around training for educators, librarians, etc. Just the nature of mandating that type of work. And I suppose I keep coming back to this conclusion because you folks have smartly put a non-regulatory recommendation, the one that speaks to having disciplines, starting to create their own disciplinary specific knowledge around how to shift pedagogical practice for STEM and for whatever area we're looking at. And I wonder, because I think there's been probably a lot of research that's shown that compliance approaches in academic spaces fall flat. Academics are critically resistant of compliance type approaches. If there were discussions with the committee or MCU or COU about how to get academics, not even necessarily affiliated with their own institutions, but maybe affiliated with their disciplines, having their own conversations about how to shift their practices, because I think we can actually develop an incredible framework from the work that we've already done in the province. I think there's a ton of codes that can be mushed together from the built environment, WCAG, UDL, et cetera, and create something fun and snazzy for the sector. But I am really concerned, and I don't want to force academics to do things either. Like I think they hold on to their values really strongly, and that's like a key part of university education. It's not in college sectors as strongly because they're ministry regulated. And that feeling I think that a lot of academics have, that their freedom is continuously being whittled away by like the corporate university, is very strong, especially post-COVID. So again, lots of rambly context, but just sort of wondering how engaged we've been with disciplines, like specific, like leadership within disciplines across Ontario and maybe outside of Ontario, to think about getting those folks to think about. And I think there are leaders that sit in those areas doing this as part of their research, and I don't know that they're being tapped or tied into this work. I have no idea actually, so I thought I would ask if that's been a thought.
Sure.
Again, sorry, that was a lot.
I'm giving Rosa a moment to catch up. Okay. I wanted Rosa, the interpreter, to catch up there.
Oh, yes. So sorry, Rosalie.
No, that's fine. It's a good point. And I think, well, let's acknowledge, like, the pandemic has really impacted
change.
Everybody, and everybody's tired, and we're coming back, and I think people are looking for something that's easier than, because we've been pivoting. So I think that's been challenging. I think I found it really interesting for myself, being a sessional instructor the last couple of summers. I really gained a perspective for the faculty side of what they're also intending, dealing with, right? There's technology that may not be accessible. That maybe there's goodwill to create closed captioning on their class if they're online or hybrid, and maybe technology may not work or it's not that easy. So I think one of the key things, and I know you asked like how we're not necessarily engaging in, when we got feedback and there were faculty on our committee. The colleges and universities and Ontario, so the COU, which is Colleges Ontario, Colleges on COU.
Colleges, Ontarios, and universities.
Colleges Ontario for universities. And then there's the Ontario Colleges, Ontario. I did it backwards. Sorry, my acronyms are backwards. They're certainly engaging, I think, looking at this. I think working with our centers for teaching and learning, I think is really important, but they also need to have resources to be able to help bring about how to support the faculty, like having educational developers to talk faculty about how to be innovative and look outside of what they maybe typically have done, and really talking about what do we learn during the pandemic. So I don't think I don't have an easy answer for you, Kate, because I think I agree with you. I think it's complicated. I think, though faculty are a crucial part of making education accessible. And so while we don't want to mandate every single thing they're doing, there are some simple things, such as make sure that you have a syllabus that is accessible so a student can read it. So make sure, that if you're purchasing technology for your classroom, you need to make sure it's accessible. So there's some key things that faculty can do easily. I can appreciate some of the other things are they're more time consuming, and then I think they need the support of their institution on how they can achieve some of the recommendations.
Yeah, I keep thinking I think it has to come down to it becomes the mission of the university, mainly because even chatting to folks in our teaching and learning center who are doing incredible work, they've been resistant to compliance oriented work in terms of being the carriers of compliance, because they're working with folks who won't build relationships with them if they take that type of approach. So I suppose it comes down to understanding, and maybe this is something that could be thought through in terms of sector-wide approaches, is that the approach as you're kind of whittling into the middle of the university has to change. We actually can't take too much of a heavy-handed compliance-oriented approach once you're dealing with academics, because like a lot of the times they'll ignore the supports, or they'll be overwhelmed and won't want to reach out to the supports, or maybe there's some sort of distrust of the supports that are available through those areas.
Yeah, and I think I see that where it's like they're overwhelmed. And so I see goodwill. I see a lot of goodwill. I think they're overwhelmed. I think one of the things, and I think this is just generally, we need to talk about the spirit of the legislation, the spirit of the Human Rights Code. It's really, it shouldn't be, this is my, Pollyanna look. I don't know. We shouldn't need legislation. We should just be, implementing those spirits, what the spirit is. And at the end of the day, if we can really, why are we doing this? Like, get to the core of it. When we have the conversation, it can help break down some of the walls, because this isn't about like hard-handed compliance. This is about, if you were a person with a disability, which, is possible that somebody may become disabled while they're working, or they are, or they are, or they have a child with a disability, a family member. What would you want for them? What would you want for you? And would you want to say, well, too bad you can't go to school because I don't feel like, I don't want to do this because I want to push in my heels and not do it because I can appreciate though, like certainly we need to give the instructors support, but I always I do try and take it from the approach of the spirit of it.
Well, and I think
Because I think when you do, it actually lets some of the walls down of like, okay, like I often hear that's what I want to. It's like, okay, how can we achieve this where you're not feeling like we're coming down with a hammer?
Yeah, and I
That's
think
like
you're
the
right.
last resort. That should be the last resort.
Yeah. Okay. I think there's always that carrot and that stick, right? The legislation is always being seen as the stick, and the carrot is the moral. It's the right thing to do for people. I think there's a third choice where it comes down to, we're a professional institution. We need to provide professional skills to our students, and that includes accessibility at this point in time. We have a question from Ren that says, given the legislative delays and timeline, how would you suggest we go about motivating senior management in post-secondary institutions to take more immediate action around these recommendations? And I think really that whole idea of how do we engage our senior leadership team to, really take the lead on this?
Yeah. And this is where I think the Colleges Ontario and the Council of Ontario Universities, they're part of that, they're part of those associations. So I think certainly right now, I think that's what's happening. I think there's a little bit more happening behind the scenes around this discussion about how can we collectively maybe work together, because there's some things that why we create the wheel, where we can do some things together. What's doable, what's not, what are you doing? Like learning from each other. I think really encouraging leadership to talk to other leaders. When I have a provost calling me for one university, I tell the, share this with your leaders as well. So I think that's an important venue. And certainly these conversations I've actually had with the ministry around engagement with leadership, and I hope to see a little bit more, because of they're engaging with stakeholders. I'm hoping to see more come out of that once they finish, kind of doing what they're doing with the ministry. The other thing is, depending on the spaces you're in, is you raising this, as an issue for even in your own work. And if you're in spaces asking about accessibility, if you're looking at procurement, and even your own department or whatever it might be, it's asking, what is it accessible? So it's forcing the conversation. If we all ask, if we all ask about it, or if we all connect the dots, it does help that trickle effect, that more people are asking the questions, and it does raise the awareness, I think, of leadership when everybody is asking those kind of questions.
You talked a lot about kind of the different barrier areas and that there's 185 recommendations. Do you have any advice on how somebody could kind of tackle these? You've talked a little bit about that, but do you have anything else that you could maybe address?
Yeah, I think about, and the way I've explained it is very much how we talk about learning strategies for students with disabilities. And often for people who have anxiety, for example, is chunking it. It is overwhelming. I can appreciate it's a lot. And so really chunking it and just saying, looking at one thing at a time. You have to look at the whole. There's a lot of connections in our recommendations, but do looking at, as I mentioned before, is just trying to chunk it of what's doable. I think Jacqueline mentioned earlier, going through and kind of, if you can find the low-hanging fruit, I think that will be the key to even just moving some of it forward, and it will feel less overwhelming when legislation comes. I think if we start now, that's why we were saying last year, let's start now, don't wait for the legislation, because it will help when the legislation rolls out.
Like Kate was saying, she's taken this on in her new role to really how to approach these standards at MAC. So MAC is obviously very proactive in this. Yes. Ren was asking, do you know of any other folks that have had success in implementing some of the standards already? Have you heard any success stories that you can share?
Not necessarily. I can see, in Western University, I've seen they have an accessibility plan, just as an example. Carleton has done some really great work around accessibility too. I think that's part of what I think is happening with the stakeholder kind of discussions right now is what are other people doing? I think that's an important of to find out what's successful and where we can leverage other people's things that they've learned and things they have done. But we don't have specifics right now. That's where we're trying to pick up some of the conversations to find out where are we at now. So I think looking at university websites and colleges and looking at what is the university and college talking about related to accessibility.
Yeah, I'm aware of a college that has put out an RFP to do a full audit on where they currently are with regards to the full AODA, but specifically the post-secondary education standard. So they want somebody to come in and audit what they're currently doing. So it's definitely on the radar and people are moving forward with it.
Yeah, with this, I can tell you with the COU, they have, from what I understand, they have a working group, accessibility working group, and other universities, are part of that. So I think the discussions, from what I can tell, are starting to pick up related to this. And I think, the same with, I work at the University of Toronto, is having conversations about where we at with this. I think very much a systemic approach where we're talking to each other, colleges and universities, I think help, because we are all overwhelmed, right? And I think, I've already said it, we're all overwhelmed. Let's not recreate the wheel. And I think that's some of the good work I've seen, even like for Council of Ontario Universities, they have a website on accessibility. I think it's a great resource for colleges and universities. So rather than each institution creating a resource, there's a the hub of resources. So taking a look at those, I think, can be helpful.
Yeah. Nadine said that students are also interested in auditing as part of their courses. And Richard, do you have a question from the University of Waterloo?
There, I've got everything unclicked. I'm also a member of the Experiential and Work Integrated Learning Ontario Board, EWO, and we were having a meeting later on today, and I'm raising this topic there as something. How can we get together as a sector to address some of the experiential education components that are raised in the in all the different recommendations? Again, trying to find that sector-wide thing, because it's an awful lot for an institution, even Waterloo with its rather massive co-op program. It's daunting to look at all of the requirements and how are we going to engage with our stakeholders. Many of them are well-intentioned, but varying levels of ability to adapt from large employers like the big banks to very small startups where some of the resources aren't there for them. Or in different ways. So we're going to start the conversation. Also trying to get a little bit ahead of the PSE standards. That's mostly a comment, not a question.
That's okay. It's fantastic.
Great. Thank you, because I think that's what needs to happen. Is we all need to go into the spaces we're in and raise it, because I think the pandemic slowed it down, the conversation, because we were all so focused on returning to in person, and we were tired. And, let's be honest, right? We're all tired from pivoting. And I think there was a bit of a lull. And I think, but now it's the time. I think we have all kind of settled back in. And I think if we can all bring it to wherever spaces we're in, it will be really important.
We have a comment. Are there any differences in expectations of accessibility excellence between colleges and universities, given the differences in available resources to colleges versus universities, which typically have a lot more staff, resources, etc.? Any advices for those working through colleges and finding a way through limited resources? Answer as an obstacles end of the road sign. So I know that we talked a lot in our groups about different sizes of institutions, because there are some much smaller academic institutions, universities and colleges like in the north that don't have as many resources available to them. So I know we definitely addressed this. Tina, did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were trying to be sensitive to that, and that's where some of the recommendations came out of being a ministry or sector-wide, response for some of the items. And certainly, I mean, I think, you know, colleges and universities, I think we're all under-resourced. I'm going to make that, I don't care if that's a public statement. Yep. I think we're all struggling. The volume of students with disabilities continues to increase. So we're feeling it both in the colleges and the university sectors. So, you know, I think this is where I don't have a specific answer. I'm sorry. I don't think there's necessarily a different in expectations. I think your point, Jennifer, around we were recognizing that some of the things that we were recommending would be harder for smaller institutions than large institutions that have more resources. So I think this is where coming together and supporting each other and connecting within the sector will help with those with limited resources. Because we can't be expected to do this all by ourselves, right? Each institution collectively needs to work with others. And I think this is, I say this to my students, it's one thing around the disability service field. I've always said it's not about competition. It's about supporting each other. And in the disability service field, I would say with the colleges and the universities, because I've worked with both, they're very open to sharing the resources and the things that they've created. And I think, you know, that's the spirit that's tying into the spirit of it.
And I think, you know, it goes back to your comment about procurement. Education, higher educational institutions as a whole have a lot of buying power if we come together. And if we push back on the vendors that it's their responsibility to make things accessible versus, you know, the institution taking it on individually, it's not going to work, right? We really need to push back on that procurement piece.
Yeah, I think that's really an important piece. Like, if you think about if, you know, let's say, you know, large institutions, colleges, universities, are asking the vendor, is this accessible? We won't purchase unless it's accessible. It's forcing the vendors to make it accessible. And then it will help those in the smaller, you know, maybe who have less resources, who have maybe, you know, don't feel like they have the same kind of voice because of the size of the institution. It's really leveraging the voices together, so that, you know, we're not all feeling like we're alone in this. And we need to have, I think it's very important that we're all saying it. It says it's powerful if we're all bringing up the same thing with vendors, for example.
Yeah. Christine, you have a question. We have about 5 more minutes.
You. Yeah, I'm Christine Zaza, University of Waterloo, workplace accessibility specialist. And my question is around the barrier area number 2, awareness and training. And there's a lot of interest and a lot of work being done on figuring out the specific training for specific audiences. And a number of those audiences have been itemized in the recommendations. We've talked a little bit about the one for educators and librarians. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice around the timing, because as much as we would want to at the University of Waterloo move forward with some of those trainings initiatives for the specific audiences, it's hard for me to envision how that would work out when we don't have the all-employee training, which I would think of as more of a core level of training for all employees, which is going to come from the ministry to the institutions. Any advice around that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think you know, it's in terms of the training, we did talk about, I'm sorry, I'm just pulling it up because I just want to make sure I have it in front of me as I'm talking about it so that I'm referencing that particular one. Yes, so I mean, we talked about certainly in any training though. So what I will tell you what I'm already doing. So we don't have specific training in certain things that I'm doing. I'm going in and talking. But what I've been doing is looking through these training recommendations. And then if I'm on that space with, like, for example, I went into something with TAs the other day. I've been doing some of the faculty. I've talked to facilities. I'm using the language from our recommendations to start priming people to start thinking about what is even ableism. They don't know what it is, right? They don't know what it means. And so I think it's just starting to incorporate really, like, even talking about it with our, like, one of the recommendations is with our student unions and our leaders. I actually find that they actually have been great in terms of understanding kind of what our goals are. But I think it's just, we're doing training in certain areas. There's EDI training that you want to look at. So it's really about incorporating it what you have now. And if you are invited into spaces to do something different, just go through these. I will tell you this one. So one of the recommendations is recommendation 32 for disability services staff. This one, Laurier and the University of Toronto Scarborough worked together to create a course through eCampus. It was funded by eCampus to create a training for disability service providers, which is now available for Ontario, across Ontario colleges and universities. And we took it directly from these recommendations. So I think it's, we have, same with the career counselors, is really just thinking about, for example, making sure our career staff are understanding the accessibility standards, the employment standards, because students are asking questions about placements and disclosure and whatnot. So it's really about just identifying where it's needed at the time, because you have to think about your resources right now. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I think there's a number of a lot of overlap in terms of the specific trainings, because it's not really role specific.
Yeah.
So I'm cautious of getting into a situation where there's a number of initiatives happening grassroots level now, and then when the all employee training does come out, and then there's more a mandate to have completed a certain amount of training, what do we consider to be training if they have already had a number of these initiatives that they've gone through? So that's, yeah. So
that's something the institutions really need to think about, how they will track. I think that will be important. It's just, maybe not, you're not developing right now you have to look at the high level of how many employees do we have? How will we do this? But this is where I think, if we're creating something, I think about, there's in the past when customer service came out, there was an online training made available to colleges and universities. And so I think that, I hope that that's what we'll see will come out of it, so that you'll be able to track who's using the training and whatnot. But I think thinking about that will be important, of how can we roll it out with the volume that we have. So I think it'll have to be a lot of online. But if we can, just like I said, start priming the audience for the language of things that they'll start seeing, it will be helpful.
Thank you.
We are running out of time. Bethany had asked if there was a repository or other way that institutions can share resources or notes on how they're working on implementation. And Kate had said, we don't want to promote uneven competition among universities. So is there a way to facilitate this collectivization? So I think maybe those two kind of can go hand in hand in a very quick answer, Tina.
Yeah, I don't know of a specific repository. And I think that's what the stakeholder piece is about right now, where they are looking at Colleges of Ontario and the COU. I think that it'll come out of these stakeholder discussions and the plans that will be rolled out. I think this is what I expect to see, a little bit of that. I will put in the Accessible Campus, if you're not aware of it, from the COU website. That's not a repository of what everybody's doing right now, just to be clear. But it's a repository. So I think right now I think we're at the stage right now where we're starting to see movement. So you have questions, but there's not always answers yet, because we need the ministry to finish their stakeholder conversation of really looking at, what can we do collectively, what needs to happen, and where the challenges into rolling it out.
Tina, thank you so much for taking the time today, and thank you for everyone for coming to have this conversation, because we do feel this is a really important way to kind of move forward the post-secondary standards. Tina, before we go, do you have any just final words you'd like to leave everybody with?
I will just say, Jacqueline, when can we expect a check? I think we'd all like a check from the ministry. I have no commitment. I don't have the authority on that one. I just want to reinforce, first of all, thank you for everybody for coming. I appreciate being able to, have the conversation, and just know that I think more will be coming from what I can tell. I think we'll start to see more action over this is me talking, nobody's, I'm hoping to see something over the next 6 months where some of the questions you have, we'll have a little bit more answers to what next.
On that note, I hope to keep moving the conversation forward. So just a reminder that next month we'll be chatting with the small committee that addressed Barrier Area 4. And that's a completely random choice, and it's completely biased because I sit on that barrier area. So that'll be the digital learning and technology. In the chat, I put the link to join the mailing list to be notified of the upcoming workshops. The whole series is going to be on the post-secondary education standards. And also, if you want to receive a recorded copy of this talk, we will send it out as well. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rosalie. Thank you, Tina. And thank you to everyone for coming today.
Quote, give them a fish, feed them for a day. Teach them to fish, feed them for a lifetime. A small green fish swims by, leaving a trail of bubbles. At accessibilityconsulting.ca, we believe in teaching you to fish. The small green fish swims diagonally downward from right to left. Two multicolored fish created from layers of geometric shapes swim to reveal the company name, accessibilityconsulting.ca. A school of small fish swims by, revealing the tagline, a collective of digital accessibility educators. Design, Aya Noishi. Animation, amphibious animation. Website, CMS Web Solutions. Description, Lakeshore Media Services. accessibilityconsulting.ca. Contact, info@accessibilityconsulting.ca. The small green fish swims by, leaving a trail of bubbles.